Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erika Schiller, and I'm joined by my Climeco colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together.
Hello, and welcome to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller. Today, we're going to talk about renewable energy development in the U.S., the impacts of investment tax credits and corporate climate goals on the future build-out of new renewable energy projects, primarily solar and wind, but could also include nuclear and geothermal. The previous U.S. presidential administration, the Biden administration, was intent on supporting climate-smart investments, including the hugely impactful Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which was passed in August of 2022. The new administration is changing things up, putting curbs on many parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, including sunsetting many of the tax credits associated with new construction of solar and wind projects earlier than initially planned. I'm joined by Tom Bidding of Advantage Capital. Advantage Capital pairs investors with renewable energy projects to help build new energy projects. Much of this financing has relied on tax credit, and that will continue for the near and medium term, but is changing because of the One Big Beautiful Bill and evolving updates such as IRS definitions that could impact further development. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I'll start with a question around the current landscape. What share of new power projects are renewable today? And maybe looking back at the past 2 or 5 years to give us an idea of the trends in the production of new power projects.
Sure. I mean, this is a great fact for most of your listeners to know, and probably many of them don't. But the short answer is that renewables are unquestionably the dominating force in new generation growth over the past several years. If you look at global numbers first, and then I'll go to US, but in 2023, renewables, predominantly solar and wind, were 86% of new capacity generation. And by 2024, that number increased to an astounding 92%. The numbers aren't in for 2025 yet, but I suspect that they've continued to increase from there. So it's massive. It is all of it. That is where the industry, the markets have gone because they can be built so quickly and because the supply chains around the world have grown up so fast to support this. Not to mention all the green objectives and the climate neutral. There's a lot of support for a number of different ways. And, these numbers just show that it's worked. I mean, 92% of new projects coming online being renewable is just an astounding number. US numbers are very similar to those. And I think one of the most telling indicators is not how much renewable energy generation has been, what percentage it has been, but how much it's planned to be. And if you look at the interconnection queues throughout the country, and the interconnection queue is effectively the line that developers have to get in with utilities and grid operators, those queues are about 95% solar, wind, and storage today. So if you're thinking, how are we going to power the economy of tomorrow? Well, the answer is clearly from renewables. 95% of the planned capacity. And I'd say that that's a pretty conservative 5-year estimate. So over the next 5 years, 95% is going to come from renewables, which that's something that frankly can't be overlooked. And while we don't need to get into the pros and cons on the debates over renewables versus fossil fuels and other legacy technologies, but the reality is that the grid operators, the utilities, the large loads, and frankly, consumers are expecting to get their power from renewable sources in the near term. And anything that gets in the way of that is almost certain to cause major problems for, society as a whole, really.
Yeah, and impact our prices of our utility power for individual consumers.
Yeah, because the reality is there's really no near-term replacements. There's been a lot of talk recently of natural gas, and that is a huge source that has grown tremendously over the past decade, which frankly is great. We do want to decarbonize and whatnot, which I think is fantastic. At the end of the day, we need the lights to turn on. Society needs more power. So the natural gas growth has been big, but today there's a 7-year wait list to get natural gas turbines. And nuclear is another one that is a fantastic option. There's a lot of talk about it in politics, and there seems to be a lot of bipartisan support. But the reality is the hurdles to get that built are likely years away. Or at least, let me say it again, a better way. The hurdles to get it built at the scale we need are years away. And those hurdles are, federal and local permitting, the actual design, safety testing, all of that stuff is just going to take time.
Can you share, how big of a role do federal tax credits like the IRA's investment tax credit and production tax credit play in the capital investment stack for a new solar project?
Sure. And I may step you back a decade or two. The investment tax credit and the production tax credit have actually been around quite a bit longer than IRA. They got a lot of publicity because they were expanded and extended significantly as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. But PTCs were created in the 90s by the first President Bush, and ITCs were created specifically for renewables in the early 2000s, actually by the second President Bush. So the credits have been around for the last 25, 30 years. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they've been renewed every couple years. So there was no real long-term policy stability around it. There was broad bipartisan support. And so they were extended on a recurring basis, but it's difficult to make big plans when you only have a 2-year runway for these infrastructure projects. IRA came and really turned that on its head and gave nearly a 10-year runway for projects and expanded the eligibility and the actual amount of tax credit. So, the IRA's impact is, it was massive. I think there's no other way to say it, is that it was massive. And even with some of the rollbacks from OB3, the tax credits today still are a material portion of overall project development. I'd say they amount to, on average, a little over 30% of any given project. And that number could get to 40 or 50% if certain adders are involved, whether they were built in specific census tracts, targeted census tracts, or built using primarily domestically manufactured equipment. So, for at least the short term, even with the rollbacks based on some of the start of construction safe harbors and whatnot, the tax credits still do play a very major role in new project development.
How is investor appetite for investment in renewable energy projects being impacted by changes to the tax credit programs? And, how much is it changing?
Again, we got a little bit of a wild ride over the last 12 months. I'd say if you split it in the investors into different buckets, I'll start with the bucket that I know best on the tax credit side. And that's, Advantage, as you mentioned at the outset, we are predominantly matching projects with institutional investors so that the institutional investor can monetize or mitigate its federal tax liability via investment in these renewable energy projects. Within that market, the appetite for tax credits is huge and growing exponentially. IRA added a concept of transferability where now you can sell tax credits, and that brought a lot more investors into the market. Renewable energy credits are the only federal tax credit that is transferable. So it's uniquely positioned from that perspective. But even the partnership investors, which is a more efficient monetization tool, a little bit more complicated, but it's a more efficient monetization tool, that market has remained very robust and will continue to be so for, frankly, as long as the tax credit remains. A big change on that front is it used to just be solar or wind. And wind investors typically weren't investing in solar and vice versa. They were, it was very specified because most wind deals were PTCs and solar deals were ITCs. And so people stayed in their lanes. That has definitely changed over recent years. We've now got investors that are doing some wind and some solar. They're doing ITCs and PTCs. And now most of them are also saying, how does storage fit into this mix? Let's do more storage projects. Let's look at geothermal. Let's look at nuclear. It's probably long-term, but they at least want to understand it and be part of it, in part to continue mitigating their tax liability, and in part because they recognize that the technology of today is not always the technology of the future. So they want to remain competitive and, remain active in the space. And doing that will require investing in new technologies, which I think becomes a self-fulfilling benefit to the industry. The more capital you have going to new technologies, the more they improve, the more they get better. And it's just, that's the capital markets at work.
Yeah, I'm curious about, you mentioned storage. Are those battery storage projects also subject to changes in tax credits?
Yes, but not nearly to the same extent. So the actual tax credit was largely left untouched, but storage projects and now all renewable energy projects, whether it's ITC or PTC, they are now subject to the foreign entity of concern rules. So it's much more, the limitations are much more around eligibility of where the equipment comes from. That is a particular challenge for storage because unfortunately China does control the vast majority of battery development and manufacturing. So avoiding, and the foreign entity of concern is specifically targeted towards Chinese goods. I mean, there's a list of a few other countries, but China is the one that matters. So the tax credit's still there. If you can get them built, you're still doing very well. If you can use domestic content or non-Chinese equipment, you're going to be fine for the next 5 to 7 years. It has added some hurdles to cross.
As the tax credits are sunsetted sooner than was initially drafted in the IRA, how could that impact consumers and businesses?
This is the one that hits the consumer pocketbooks. As I mentioned, the tax credits really created more than just the specific projects. They created an infrastructure and an ecosystem around these projects. The amount of new manufacturing that resulted from the IRA is in the hundreds of thousands of jobs in terms of solar module manufacturing, inverters, batteries, other equipment that goes into it, and just the explosion of new project development that is bringing more and more low-cost power to the grid. So how does the sunset of these tax credits impact things? It really creates a material disruption in the market. Capital stacks are called into question. Project economics are called into question. We've seen a lot of projects have to renegotiate their power purchase agreements. So what is the price they're selling their energy for? And you can guess which way those have all gone. And it's up. If you're losing 30% of your capital stack, you have to replace that somehow. And the answer is it's going to be replaced by higher power costs. And so the market, consumers, businesses, whichever one it is, just the buyers of power will see higher costs. That's the easy answer. That's the less painful answer. The more painful answer is that if we're not able to build enough projects and you're starting to see real grid strain, and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning that was talking about the grid strain in PJM, the amount of power demand from data centers and AI is just through the roof. And it's something that our grids and our utilities have never seen before. And so the odds of blackouts or rolling brownouts and rate increases and all that, it goes up dramatically. I can't say that that's all because of the sunset to the tax credits, but the sunset to the tax credits will exacerbate all of those problems by slowing down the pace of development. I will say, I don't think we were building power fast enough even with the incentives. So we were already probably coming up short, and now we're kind of cutting off our knees as we're going into a space or, a time of unprecedented energy demand growth in the US and frankly, the world.
And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the news about wind projects. Offshore wind has really been impacted by the current administration. There have been 4 or 5 projects off the East Coast that have all been paused and are fighting in court. How could these changes in the administration's approach toward wind power impact power demand, impact reliability? What are you hearing from investors about this space?
Wind is definitely a a hot potato. It's one of the new bad words in ESG now in Washington. Any wind project, domestic or offshore, has major obstacles to cover. Offshore, even more specifically, you're right. The five big ones, I mean, these amount to tens of gigawatts of power generation and gigawatt, I mean, this is massive. This is hundreds of thousands or millions of homes that can be powered based on these projects. So stopping their construction, and most of it is stopping construction, not development. A lot of these are under construction. One of them was 95% complete when they got the stop work order. And so this is tens of billions of dollars that have been invested. I mean, there's the economic impact to all of those investors that is material, but there's also, the utilities plan on this power years in advance. And so if you're pulling the plug on something months before it's supposed to turn on, that's going to have major ripple effects. And what are the specific ripple effects? I think it's a little bit too early to say because none of them have gone fully operational yet. But as we're looking at utility planning, how do they replace that? There's no, short of keeping, some of the recent emergency executive orders from DOE to keep coal plants open, which is a whole nother issue that causes problems, right? It's very expensive to keep those open and to change the plans. There's really no other alternative. So I think you are going to see significant rate increases, but you're also going to see a very high level of stress on the grid operators. And it will likely come in the form of brownouts. We want the power to turn on when we flip the switch. And in the US, we've been very accustomed to that. And these kinds of decisions really hurt that. And ultimately, I think it really comes down to a question of who should be deciding and how. The markets have invested billions in these projects. The utilities have accepted them. They want them. They've built, their infrastructure to do this. The developers have invested to build them. And so the market says, this is what we want. To have an outside party come in and say, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to pick something else. I mean, that just really flies in the face of kind of our capitalist system and letting the free market decide. And so, what are the consequences going to be? I'm not real sure, but they're not going to be good.
How are you talking to investors about, 2026, 2027, when you're looking at new project investments?
There are a lot of projects trying to get built as quickly as possible. And so in the very near term, I hate to say it's business as usual because it's not. The market has changed, the dynamic has changed, but the volume of projects looking to get financed and looking to get financed faster to try and accelerate, to beat some of these issues and to take their permits and get it done as quickly as possible. I mean, that is all happening. And so the discussions with investors in the very near term are, let's get as much as we can while we still can. But then what does this look like in 28, 29, 30, and into the early 30s? And there is where we have a lot of discussions around potentially transitioning technologies, right? It may not be all solar. Now we're going to do a lot more storage. Let's start to get smarter around nukes. Let's start to nuclear. Let's start to educate them on nuclear. Let's look at geothermal and some of the other technologies that are out there. There are a lot of technologies and the credits will last a long time. It really comes down to a question of scale. And nothing has the scalability of solar, wind, and storage. Ask me again in a handful of years and nuclear probably picks up the baton on that front. The other technologies probably aren't able to replace it at scale. It just is really a question of how long till we really commercialize the next technology.
Yeah, I think it's scale, but it's also, speed and price. Nuclear historical has been very expensive. Every project has been very custom. So it's not a copy paste like we're able to do with solar. So
that is one of the really cool things about the small modular reactors. I mean, I am personally very, very excited about those. I think they have tremendous potential to change the dynamic of our grid entirely. And they probably are the future of how we power the country. The reality is we're not there yet. And just because we know what the future technology could be doesn't mean that we stop building everything else. We have to take as good as we have, and then we can build what's better. And maybe, who knows, maybe fusion at some point gets us there. And we've got proof of concepts, but we're not there yet. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't invest in it, and we shouldn't invest in the things that we have today. But you are spot on. Nuclear has been very expensive and historically way over budget and way past timelines. So that one's really hard to count on.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was really interesting hearing from you about the impacts and market dynamics. Are there any parting thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, very much appreciate being here, and thank you for having me. I guess the parting thought that I'd end on is that this really is not a question about whether we need power. There is no doubt, if you ask anybody on either side of the aisle in any industry, we need more power. We are in an unprecedented growth cycle in the US in terms of demand growth. So the question is, how and what should we be doing to build as much power as possible? And in the near term, I think we need to be taking every step we can to get as much new generating capacity on the grid as possible. And as a country, we have the technology, we have the capital, we have the smarts to be able to do this and be able to be the world leaders and solve this problem. Let's get it on the grid. And, will it be perfect? No, but we can fix it as we go. And we just need as much as we can. And so, we kind of got to get out of our own way and just let us build.
Super interesting. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Erika.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop. Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit climeco.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.